Welcome to Wickedly Smart Conversations, a podcast where you'll hear interviews and commentary about technology and programming. This is Elizabeth Robson from wickedlysmart.com, and today I'm bringing you a recent conversation I had with José Aguinaga, who is a front-end developer and wrote a funny and insightful essay last October about JavaScript and the frustrations some of us have with the JavaScript ecosystem and how quickly it changes. All right, so hey, I'm here with José Aguinaga. And so José, thank you so much for coming on the Wickedly Smart podcast.
Thank you for the invitation, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you're primarily a front-end developer, is that correct?
That is correct. I've been working with JavaScript and web technologies for over 7 to 8 years, more or less.
Okay, so right in the thick of things with JavaScript over its
yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. And so do you do most of your work in JavaScript, or do you do a variety of different languages?
Right. So for a good chunk of my years, I did mostly good old plain JavaScript. It's directly coding. I mean, of course, at some point I look at some libraries. I think some even preprocessors. I never got into CoffeeScript, even though a lot of people do it. Nowadays, currently, I'm working in a startup here in Switzerland, and I do mostly TypeScript. I still struggle with a lot of the types issues, but yeah, that's what mostly I'm doing nowadays.
Okay, very interesting. I haven't looked at TypeScript much at all, although I hear a lot about it. So yeah, it's something I want to spend some time learning about.
It's pretty interesting, but kind of overwhelming a little bit at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. So I read the article that you posted a few months ago about how it feels to learn JavaScript in 2016. And not only did I find it very funny, which was great, but it also really resonated with me because I feel the same way about it. And your article is about how front-end web development has become so complex because of this overwhelming number of tools and libraries in the JavaScript ecosystem. And it's causing this JavaScript fatigue, which I thought was great. It's a great name for it, as you call it.
Yeah.
So I was kind of guessing that was your own experience of this complexity that kind of inspired you to write this article.
Right. Yes. So yeah, that article has been one of the most shared pieces that I ever wrote. I think it resonated with a lot of people in the community, and it got very, very well distributed. I gave recently a talk about it, and what I didn't mention too much is it was actually it came from a real talk that I had with a friend from college, and when we started when we were working together, he actually introduced me in web development, and many years later we gathered together, and he actually moved to driver development, very low level environment, and he had to work mostly with the C compiler or the GCC. And when I was telling him about some of my struggles that I was having, because I switch a lot between jobs, and every job, every startup that I work with, I had a completely different stack. I told him about these problems, and he just couldn't relate to this at all. He was like, "Wow, I only have to read up to the patch notes like once a year for maybe bugs or fixes." And to me, just hearing that, it was just insane, and that other environments don't have to deal with this super fast pace that we do in the web development. And then I eventually use the knowledge that I've been picking and my experience between these startups that I change here every once in a while, and I wrote this article, which of course it's kind of a little bit of a conversation between me and my friend. The funny thing is my friend just gave up after 3 questions. He was like, "You know what? This is just way too much." And yeah, of course, I extended the entire article to go on and on.
Yeah, well, it was terrific, and it was so funny, and I shared it a lot too. So it sounds like it resonated with a lot of other people as well. And I thought you did a really good job with your talk in Italy too, of kind of extending that idea into this thing of like fear of missing out in the JavaScript world, which is exactly how I feel all the time. So I imagine you got a lot of people resonating with your talk in Italy as well.
Yeah. So what I found out is that so the problem, what I feel is that is so a lot of people take the JavaScript fatigue a little bit in from the wrong side, right? Especially open source maintainers, the creators of these tools, of these amazing tools that are bread and butter for a lot of developers out there. They feel a little bit attacked when we complain about the JavaScript ecosystem, and that was not my goal at all when I wrote that article. What I wanted to say is that for a lot of newcomers, this incredibly overwhelming tools that it's out there in order for you to develop kind of like the best application out there can be pretty intimidating. And it not only affects how new people come to the ecosystem, but it also affects how we as a community learn and develop ourselves. So one example that I gave in my talk is that, for instance, new companies are starting to look for people that know a specific technology, right? So maybe years ago, I gave an example that I was very proficient in Angular JS, which is a very good framework that now has a second iteration, Angular 2.x, I think, and it's a very well used. And back then, it was a very popular framework. And then Facebook published this React framework that suddenly caught so much attention, and now people companies started looking for, instead of Angular JS, they started looking for React JS developers. So if you have developers like me that got very into Angular JS, suddenly you're put in a position that your skills might not be as valuable. So now, if you don't adapt, if you don't invest a great amount of your time, which usually is your free time, you might feel lag. And one of the examples that I gave is I made a comparison whether people think that maybe Angular developer earn less than React developer, and most people thought like, no, that's no way. But then when I asked them, hey, mate, what do you think about ActionScript developers? People that were doing Flash, and of course the audience was like, oh well, of course, and that's what happens. Imagine you were doing Flash for many years, and suddenly your language, your main tool set that you work, even certifications programs by Adobe, suddenly got outdated. So that's how I think the dynamic is going on currently at ecosystem. We need to be careful about how do we approach it and how do we move forward as a community.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's funny that you mentioned Flash because I'm just working on a project to kind of rebuild a front-end application from Flash into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and look at, trying to evaluate some tools and so on. And it's a high risk for the company because if they spend a lot of time and effort building an application that relies on a particular set of tools and libraries, then if that suddenly falls out of favor and it's not updated and it's not maintained, or like Angular going from 1 to 2 where we had to completely refactor our code,
right,
that's a big risk for companies to take. And so we're being very cautious about the decisions we make and how we build this. And I keep coming back to, I just want to use JavaScript and jQuery because I know those work and I know that they're solid.
Right. Yeah. So it's great you mentioned that, because actually during the conference, when I was the Q&A, there was a person that asked. He asked, well, so I'm a PHP web agency, right? Like I work with a lot of PHP developers, and some of the problems we're having now is that we are having a lot of trouble finding new graduates that are interested in learning PHP and are interested in picking up these tools. And that's another problem, right? It's not only, you mentioned this risk about picking a choice for an application. Sometimes the web moves so fast forward, and I think it's surrounded a lot about this from this startup culture that things move so fast that sometimes we forget a lot of times the applications people develop are supposed to sustain customers for many years. I think a lot of the times we forget that we live in software that not always is updated as web pages are. So how can you maybe in 5 years sustain an application that maybe in 5 years is no longer people don't want to study or don't want to work with?
Exactly.
That's another big risk that companies also have to tackle. So yeah, it's tricky.
And it's one thing if you're Facebook and Google and if you have a ton of money and a ton of developers you can throw at it. But if you're a small company and you have a limited amount of money to maintain an application, then yeah, I think it's a big challenge for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, that's the risk, when you take that decision, you're flipping a coin, and let's hope whatever framework we choose is going to be around in the next 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, given that things seem to be moving so fast all the time with front end development, where do you see this going? Do you think that, given the number of people that resonated with what you're saying and that clearly this is an identified problem, do you think that front end development will kind of settle down a little bit, or do you continue to see, or do you think that we'll continue to have this incredibly fast moving development for quite a while?
I think currently we're probably going to keep changing a lot of the tooling we have. I don't see in the forthcoming future that the web development is going to stabilize anytime soon. And the reason why is because there's a lot of demand from not only, let's say, customers, but in general the technology atmosphere, so to speak, is very hungry for innovation. I will say, I compare a little bit again to bring this startup culture. A lot of this, fast innovating tools and frameworks came from trying to be faster, be better, which in web development sometimes is not even necessary. I mean, a lot of the times this framework choices are like, oh, I'm shaving 100%, 100 milliseconds performance, and you're like, well, is that really worth it? But that's this hungry for innovation. So I think there's a lot of technologies that we should probably start looking forward in, that are really, I think they're going to take a lot of influence in the incoming future. I mean, already things like TypeScript, that it's still picking up, but it's just completely different, a superset of JavaScript on its own. There's some, I mean, other approaches to the web development, such as WebAssembly or tooling like ASM. I think that's another thing that in the future I think will be very, very popular. I believe, just because of the native performance. WebGL is another technology that we might see more and more in the future using. I mean, currently probably nobody really codes WebGL directly. They use most likely 3GS and other tooling. But if in the future we can just make WebGL super portable and super native, what stops us from changing our forms to really 3D animation forms, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're going to stabilize anytime soon. We're probably have to keep being on this constant loop of keep updating and keep learning about these incoming frameworks. I mean, just recently on I mentioned that on the article I mentioned that probably there were no JavaScript frameworks written during during the write of this article, and
Uh-huh.
actually 8 days later, John from Facebook, this brand new package manager came out, and now that's probably one of the most important tools we should be learning in order to do proper repository manager. So
That's funny. So, given that things are going to continue moving fast and there's a lot out there, where do you recommend that beginners begin with all of this, especially once they've kind of learned the core JavaScript language? If they want to get a front end development job, what should they focus on?
right. So I definitely think that we should focus in native JavaScript and vanilla JavaScript that uses zero libraries, that relies in nothing uh, but the libraries that come on the browser, or in case of Node.js on the V8 engine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is you need to understand the language and how do you use your programming knowledge. I mean, even though JavaScript is a very friendly kind of has a very low entry bar for getting the hello world out there, and that's probably the beauty and how it became so popular. It's still a programming language that requires solid foundations in some of the knowledge of computer science or the applications you use. And I think making sure you understand that foundations, and maybe not necessarily with JavaScript, but in general, is the most important thing. And then trying to adapt it with native JavaScript. My second thing will be to really focus on, I mean, the moment you know JavaScript, you understand scopes, closures, this object. You can probably start moving to more modern applications of JavaScript, and by that I mean how do you package applications in the browser, right? And that's a little bit more specific on some of the flavors of JavaScript in terms of browser, and try to learn a little bit of web APIs, so you can start working a little bit and expand the tooling you know how to do, you know what to do. And my final approach will be specifically focused on applications, because I think a lot of the time people learn tools based on how popular they are. But in reality, I think you should focus more on what kind of industry and applications you want to develop, in case you have already a mindset that, let's say, you want to start a company, you want to start an application, and you research what things work best for specific scenarios. I see tooling the same way that I see real life tooling. If you have a hammer, everything will look like a nail, right?
Yes,
So instead,
yep.
try to learn all the tools you want, and then see the problem you want to solve and find the right tool for that, not the other way around. Because one of the examples that I gave in the conference is, as I mentioned, I learned AngularJS for some time, and for me it was very hard to move away from there, because I was so obsessed, and my mindset was an Angular mindset, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I had to stop learning and actually undo what I knew from Angular to move away. So really focus on the problem you want to solve. And if you want to say, let's say you want to build a career in front-end developer, I will say that, again, stress on the basic foundations. A lot of the interviews that I've been going to, a lot of the companies that I know, startups, they always make, the smart companies always put, I want you to know vanilla JavaScript, because if you know vanilla JavaScript, you will tackle whatever framework we pick, because companies switch as much as the ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. So in one company I was doing Angular, and then 6 months later I'm doing React, and there's no way they can hire a person that, immediately knows both ways. So what I want to hire is smart and very, very adapt people in the JavaScript ecosystem. They can really switch. So I wouldn't say that I will say that if you want to learn front-end developer, really focus on the very basic of JavaScript. There's a lot of really good resources out there. Focus on the really specific quirks of the language, because that's something that makes JavaScript very tricky. It's very popular, but in its own way has a lot of flaws that, as you're learning, those are the kind of knowledge that will make you kind of ahead of, and that only comes with experience, and only comes with really, really learning the language.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's terrific advice. Really great. Thank you. And in terms of the browser makers, kind of where do you see them taking the whole front-end development area? I mean, because they're, in some ways, they're kind of in control of where all this is heading, and kind of drive what libraries and what frameworks we need.
Right. So I've been very lucky to have work with people that actually been involved in W3C standards, or being pushing kind of approaches on how the browsers implement, specifically from Mozilla, from Google. And I think the stand browsers are currently taking or they're trying to be as compatible as possible. I think that's a very healthy approach. In the way that for a long time, many browsers just did whatever they wanted to do, right? Mm-hmm. And the current approach for most browsers is, let's make things standard. I'm not going to try to implement my own fancy toys, even though it will be great, but let's just get a standard. Some browsers like Google, they're like, you know what, let's just go and do web Bluetooth and, implement all these awesome, cool tools. But it's very hard for all the browsers, as you say, some of the companies that have the resources to add all these really fancy features, they will do it. But some of them that don't give maybe web the importance that other companies do, then they will face this bad reputation. Which, for instance, I mean, Internet Explorer cannot escape, right?
Yep.
Nowadays, a lot of people, Microsoft Edge, which I think is the latest version, it's actually not that bad, right? But mm-hmm. It still has that bad reputation, just because for many years Microsoft couldn't keep up with a lot of the effort that Mozilla or Google were putting on their own browsers. In my personal opinion, I think the stance in the future should be to continue keeping the standards, and specifically allow developers to really rely on technologies they can use in the future. And really agreeing on solutions that make sense. To give an example, for instance, we have web Bluetooth, right? It's something that you can actually use nowadays in some nightly builds of Google, right? But that doesn't mean we should have in all the browsers, and maybe for some cases makes sense. And how do you compromise in a person? Let's say there's a person that wants to develop a Bluetooth-based web solution, and you can only say, well, it only works on Chrome, right? And I think even though pushing those technologies to the very end works very well, maybe the web is not necessarily the best environment to really push the very ends. I know there's people out there that, if with that mindset, we wouldn't have WebGL, we wouldn't have WebAssembly. But I think there's a very big importance for beginners, for sometimes to really standardize some APIs that people can rely on forward. We shouldn't have to use pages like, can I use .com to just make sure whether this API works or not, or because people will get excited, right? People will think, oh, I can use this and can use that, and then suddenly only works in 50% of the browser. So if the web is supposed to be this homogeneous environment where you can get everything working, the fact that some browsers are pushing these really exciting technologies I think breaks the web a little bit. So we should. Luckily, we have progressive approaches such as progressive web apps, where we for some time we just make sure which features some browsers have, and then we start using those as they go. But that also adds some maintainability and code. So I think I will hope that some browsers could slow down with the features, and we can just get to the point that we can stabilize ourselves. Might not be the most popular opinion, because I think we all love fancy toys. We all love pushing the technologies to the limits. But I do think, for the sake of stability and for the sake of making sure we can have everyone on board, might be worth to just slow down and pace down a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm 100% with you on that. And I definitely don't want to go back to the days of Internet Explorer versus Netscape. Those were brutal.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you couldn't even use the standard script tag. I remember you had to specify. I did some work in Netscape, and they didn't even use the standard script we have. I mean, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago when we actually started agreeing that which kind of script tag do we use for using JavaScript. That's crazy.
It is crazy.
Only 8 years ago. That's nothing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and I do, like you mentioned, the W3C, and from that perspective, I really appreciate their work, because they really help to make life a little bit more sane for front-end developers.
Definitely, and all the companies that are pushing that work forward. I mean, luckily it's an open consortium, so you can definitely push some of your own ideas and your own approaches. But a lot of companies, Adobe has done a lot of work lately. Microsoft, Google. There's many companies that put in a lot of effort to just making sure we standardize that, and I think that's what we need. I agree.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, it sounds like JavaScript will continue to be challenging, but interesting going forward. So
yeah, I'm really excited. The future looks great. The future looks exciting. Sometimes when I talk about this, sometimes people think, oh, it's very overwhelming, Java fatigue and everything. But what people don't see sometimes, it's a career opening, right? I mean, you can. I think a lot of things are going to come, and you enjoy JavaScript and you enjoy the web development industry. There's going to be a lot of careers, a lot of projects going out there, and that's great for everybody, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Jose, and I look forward to hearing more from you about JavaScript development. And listeners can find you on Twitter at JJ Perez Aguinaga, where they can find your slides, and I'll link to your Twitter, so you don't have to worry about spelling that. And I noticed that you post your presentations and your slides and stuff on your Twitter account, so that's great. People can find more about that. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Elizabeth.